Alright, time to go back to Loud Equals Funny and cover Part 2 Electric Boogaloo of stealing German stuff in World War II, which is arguably more fun and more infuriating than the other half of the story. It's time to crack open the nutcase that is Operation Lusty, which I couldn't figure out how to make a joke over without getting demonetized, so we're just gonna move on. See, this video isn't about bedroom time, it's about tech, and from the American perspective in the Second Wartime World Cup, the Germans had better toys. And if you know America, you know that when we see somebody with nicer things, we tend to get a very, very slight understanding of communism because that stuff's about to be ours. To that end, America's anime protagonist General Henry Hap Arnold, the U.S. Army Air Force's commander, established teams of technical analysis and recovery specialists called Air Technical Intelligence Teams based out of the Technical Data Laboratory at Wright Field, Ohio. These teams would compete with each other to pick up information from monitoring developments in the air wars over Germany and Japan to guide U.S. forces into better fighting the enemy. Know your enemy and know yourself. Real basic Sun Tzu type of tactics here. However, as the war proceeded, these teams would quickly figure out that the only thing better than observing the enemy to figure them out was stealing the enemy to figure them out, and as you might have guessed, they promptly decided to make a habit out of it. And as D-Day approached in 1944, Arnold and many other top officers realized they were going to have a golden opportunity to do just that.
Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
The common logical conclusion was that as the Allied lines advanced across Germany, behind those front lines would be enemy bases and facilities with German engineering at it, that would also most likely be free of any resistance. So in the months leading up to D-Day, two powerhouses started putting together a plan. In the right lane was the project oversight by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, and in the left lane was the project's direction under the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, as well as its head, General William Wild Bill Donovan. With these powers combined, they would create a blacklist of German technology they specifically wanted to capture to further their own research efforts. This list included technologies such as advanced prop-driven aircraft, radars, rockets, guided air-to-surface weapons, silent submarine propulsion, jet engines, and of course, jet aircraft, especially the Me-262 Schwalbe, the first operational jet fighter introduced in 1944, right as the mission was being planned. They've got the time, they've got the targets, now they just need the teamwork to make the dream work. So to get this party started, the powers that were established a provisional or temporary unit called the 54th Air Disarmament Squadron, led by a colonel and engineering test pilot by the name of Harold Hal Watson. And I'm gonna be completely honest with you here, I think they missed a huge opportunity with the naming convention because the term disarmament just doesn't feel right. It's like going out to dinner with your buddy and hearing him order a steak medium well when you know damn well it should be done medium rare. I know it's possible they called it the Air Disarmament Squadron to cast suspicion away from what the unit was actually meant to do, but let's call a spade here. We could have had a unit called the Five-Finger Discount Division.
You had one job.
Regardless of their choice of naming convention, they at least had good choices of leadership. Watson was a charismatic officer who was really good at delegating responsibilities and was able to find multiple people who were willing to handle the administrative work, which gave him the freedom to oversee and operate the project directly. With this freedom, he immediately got to work figuring out who he needed, what he needed, and how to get the who and what from point A to point B and back. And given that this wasn't your average mission, he noted there were three major issues he was gonna have to contend with. Issue number one was the Mobile BOGO Brigade actually had to find the tech lying around in the middle of a war zone, and when they did, they would then have to contend with the US Army they were following behind and hope that for once the Army didn't see a black cross and just light it up like Times Square on New Year's Eve. Assuming it was at least usable and reparable, then they'd have issue number two, learning how to fly them. Why would they need to fly them, you ask? Because Watson knew that the people who don't know what they're doing can make mistakes, and if the planes were disassembled for shipping and reassembled later, mistakes or even breakages would probably be made in the reassembly process, which could cause God knows how much damage to the limited number of airframes they'd be able to take with them. So the only option was to find a way to transport them back stateside in one piece, and that was assuming they didn't lose any before they got there, because the flying problem itself had two parts. For one, they're not building stuff over there in English. Sie sprechen Deutsch da drüben. They speak German over there. That means you're gonna have to know German, regardless of whether you're a pilot reading the instruments or a mechanic trying to read the labels on the equipment and maintenance hatches. For this reason, a large portion of the men that Watson recruited for the 54th were bilingual and often descendants of Germans who had immigrated to the US before the war. With the language barrier dealt with, then they would run into the other half of the flying problem, which was that the pilots would have to learn to fly the planes while in the field. Now I need you to cease immediately. Let me put this into perspective. When the second wartime World Cup started and they were rushing people into service to expand the armed forces in the United States, the training for a new pilot took 9 months, which would give them between 200 and 300 hours of flight time. These guys are going to have to learn to fly these aircraft in the field in what is probably going to be in a few days. So in order to make sure the pilots from the Repo Regiment could handle the variety of turn rates they encountered, Watson made it a requirement that all pilots in the program had to have a minimum of 1,000 hours of flight time, on top of the preference to speaking German. And while I couldn't find any information suggesting there was a reason for it, my speculation is that the variety of unknowns they could encounter was one of the reasons there was a predominance of P-47 Thunderbolt pilots in the 54th. The Thunderbolt may be my favorite aircraft in history, period, but it is not what I would call agile. I mean, there's a reason it got nicknames like the Fatty from Farmingdale. It was the largest single-engine plane built by the Allies in all of World War II, and when suited up for a night on the town, it ranged in weight from just over 6 to over 7.5 tons, depending on the ordnance load. The sheer variety of flight characteristics P-47 pilots were accustomed to handling would give them an edge in handling the unknown variety of flight characteristics they would come up against.
I got this.
With the collection company now assembled, all they had to do was get ready for the big day. And after June 6, 1944, when the Allies landed on Normandy and started pushing inland, the mission, later named Operation Lusty in April of 1945 as an acronym for Luftwaffe Secret Technology, was kicked off by the 54th Air Disarmament Squadron, now called by their nickname Watson's Wizards. And they weren't alone either. American and British operatives from the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee would follow behind Allied lines and locate technology to be handled by Watson and the Wizards. Further, to help supplement the search and seizure efforts, General Carl Toohey Spatz, the commander of all air forces in the European theater, ordered that all personnel, quote, not engaged in critical operation duties to seek out the technical scientific intelligence that would be of material assistance in prosecution of the war against Japan. This operation was considered so important that General Dwight Eisenhower personally set up a precaution to make sure no prying or prideful bureaucratic garbage got in the way by giving Watson a card that said, quote, the bearer of this card will not be interfered with in the performance of his duty by the military police or by any other military organization. You know the military has officially stopped playing games when they set up countermeasures to make sure even politicians can't screw this up. It is game on.
Yeah! What you got, Jen? What you got?
And that was perfect, because actually utilizing the 5-finger discount Toys R Us they assembled was enough of a metric pain in the Freedom Seeds all on its own. The prop-driven aircraft they picked up, like the FW-190s and BF-109s, they could manage just fine, but the jets were a whole different ballgame. While some were flown in and surrendered by their pilots, most of the tech the US absconded with was collected in the last 2 months of the war, and the Me-262 jets were mostly picked up from the Luftwaffe Air Base at Lechfeld. They didn't find a whole lot of toys prior to that because, just as Watson had predicted, most of the aircraft found behind Patton's advancing lines had undergone lead-based conversion to the most inedible Swiss cheese on the planet, or were just bulldozed until it looked like they got hit with a Miley Cyrus music video. So while they managed to find the tech, they had to fix it. To this end, Watson had originally ordered his assistant and P-47 pilot First Lieutenant Robert C. Strobel to confiscate the German mechanics' tools to help with the repair efforts, but he'd refused, because he understood that out here in the middle of Devastation Land, the German people really had nothing left and they were desperately scrabbling for work. The mechanics' tools were basically the only ticket they had to being able to make a living again. And in what I would certainly call a character-defining moment, Strobel decided there was no way he was going to take a man's livelihood away from him. So now, whether to fix the planes or fly them, the Wizards were gonna need help, and as luck would have it, most of the German mechanics and pilots they found along with their equipment were actually pretty happy to help out. This was most likely due to that little fact that we mentioned earlier: there's basically no money and no work in a war-torn land. The Germans knew that working for the Americans meant they might be able to feed their families and maybe even get a pass out of Germany. But if you ask me, I think there's also a little more to it, because I am convinced that every engineer and mechanic chose that path in life because they still have that deep down emotional drive of, hey mom and dad, look what I can do. Put yourself in their shoes for a minute. You've just been given up on and left behind by your countrymen, the people who are supposed to protect you, and then you had to watch as the machines you spent so much time and effort on effectively get kicked across the floor by a wave of people who really don't care what happens to you. Suddenly here comes a group of people who actually find the byproduct of your blood, sweat, and tears valuable and want your help putting it back together. I promise you, that little kid in your heart that's invested so much time into this IRL Lego set is immediately going to go into full show-off mode, and you're going to start pointing out to your new dad how to put it back together.
Finn, did you make all of this?
In addition to all the mechanics, 3 German test pilots fluent in English would eventually help the Americans throughout their mission from start to finish. There was a 4th, but between his uniform and his attitude, he made it very clear that he was on the numbnut side of the playing field, so he didn't stick around for very long. Thanks to their new German friends and some 2-seat trainer models of the 262 that had been found and repaired, flight training actually went much better than expected. The German pilots were actually impressed at how quickly the Americans adapted to the jet tech with training, because they only each needed 1 flight to adjust, which was kind of ironic because that's about all the flight training they got from Germany due to resource shortages. And after they figured out how to fly the aircraft, it was time to start taking inventory of their makeshift El Dorado and figuring out how to get their new mountain of flying gold back home. But they were going to figure it out because, let's face it,
On the one hand, gold. On the other hand, painful, agonizing failure.
and when I say mountain, I mean holy shiza they had a haul. The primary goals for the mission were to find 10 Me-262s and 4 AR-234 Blitz jet bombers. To start, they ended up collecting 12 Me-262 jet fighters, including 3 2-seat trainer variants, 1 Nachtjäger or Night Hunter version which had radar, and a Pulksgestoche or bomber destroyer version with a BK-5 50mm automatic cannon stuffed into the nose instead of the usual quad 30s. Now, I'm no firearms expert, but if there's one thing I understand in particular,
Just love cannons.
so I'm not surprised that Watson chose to claim this particular plane as his personal vehicle. However, the Wizards had less luck with the blitzes and were only able to find 2 of the required 4. But Watson learned that the British had found some at a base up in Norway, so he hatched a plan. He went to the British and told them that he had been authorized to take the aircraft back to the United States. The British, always happy to work with the Americans, gave him the old "sounds great kid, have fun," and gave him the jets. It was only after he got into the air that those base officers got word from their superiors that the transfer had not been authorized, and the paperwork Watson had handed them had been forged by the administration team he had expertly delegated when the Wizards were assembled. But he got away with it, because I mean, what were they gonna do, shoot him down? So they got 4 out of 4 blitzes and 12 out of 10 262s, and that's just the tip of the iceberg because they also picked up a whole host of other planes. First, there were the FW-190 Vergers, also called the Shrikes or the Butcher Birds. They nabbed 5 short-nosed A and F versions and 4 long-nosed Dora versions, along with 2 others for a total of 11. There was a Ta-152 Interceptor, 3 Gustav model BF-109s, and 2 Do 335 Files or Arrows, which were double-ended thrust sticks with pull props up front and push props out back. They grabbed 3 of the HE-219 Uhu or Eagle Owl night fighters with radar, as well as a pair of frontline bombers, a Ju-88 and a more advanced Ju-388. They even grabbed some helicopters, like 2 of the Flettner FL-282 intermushing rotor helicopters and 1 Doppelhoff WNF-342, the first helicopter in the world to have tip jet propulsion, or rotor blades driven by jets of air shot out the wingtips instead of using a crankshaft. And last on the list of airframes kept intact were an Me-108 executive transport plane and a Ju-290 cargo plane that the Wizards nicknamed the Alles kaputt, after a German post-war slang phrase which roughly translates to everything lost or all destroyed, referring to the state of the country at that time. Just rubbing salt into the wound at that point.
That's not fair.
But wait, there's so much more. While they wouldn't have the space to fly these back, they also ended up collecting 10 Me-163 Comet rocket interceptors, an HE-177 Greif, nicknamed the Luftwaffe's Lighter for its tendency to cast fireball on its own engine housings, and some HO-229 flying wing jet fighters. And this is on top of the V-2 missiles, V-1 buzz bombs, Fritz-X radio-controlled bombs, HS-293 anti-ship glide bombs that could use either radio, wire, or even TV guidance, and literal piles of documentation and information on advanced wings, supersonics, jet tech, liquid fuel rocketry and chemical engineering, synthetic fuel production, infrared technology and emissions detection systems, ballistic missile production and plans for advanced guided missiles and multi-stage ICBMs. Even space medicine and military intelligence on the Soviets was yoinked back to the States. Forget taking everything in the kitchen sink, these guys basically ripped up the plumbing and stole the floorboards. They took everything that wasn't nailed down down and everything that was. The Toys R Us Numbnut edition had a final total stock of over 16,300 items, or 6,200 tons of material, most of which had to be crated because, well, you could probably make a few landfills out of all that treasure. And that's not even including the mid-flight losses they suffered on the way there. These losses didn't occur at first, with the exception of the Nachtjager 262 having a landing accident at a Norwegian refueling stop during the ferry flight over, which it was repaired from a few weeks later. Eventually, they managed to get every plane to a French airport southeast of Paris, where they were held so General Spatz could inspect the remarked Wunderwaffe via an air show. He was particularly impressed with the last pass of the show, where Strobel performed a vertical barrel roll in the 262, such that the European Air Force's commander commented to Colonel Watson, "Pal, that's a wicked airplane. I'm sure glad the Germans screwed up the tactical use." But after the air show, the fun and games were over and it was back to business, and back to worrying about things like sabotage and accidents. Sabotage was first on the list because there were a lot of cases where allies would walk up to a piece of German tech and it would go,
Do you want to explode?
because multiple times throughout the expedition, there were booby traps planted in the planes. There were several Me-262s with cockpit traps, and there were two found in different FW-190s, one under a seat that was disarmed and another in the wings that exploded, injuring no one but destroying that plane. The Ju-290 cargo plane also had a bomb planted in it by forced labor, because that's who the Germans brilliantly sent their planes to for overhauls. It was faulty, but they didn't find it until after it was back in the United States, where it was flown by Watson personally, making it the only aircraft flown to the United States directly from Europe. Also, while the Germans had helped them previously, Watson was still a bit wary of their new friends. You can't really blame him, they had just finished fighting these guys, and it was possible they could still hold grudges and just be biding time to cause problems. To counter any possibility this might become a problem, Watson would not assign pilots to their aircraft until right before it was time to get up in the air. While this proved to be unnecessary, it was unfortunately pure chance that one of the first mission losses saw the German pilot Willy Hoffmann at the controls of the Pulkgestruche when one of the engines exploded mid-flight. He survived bailing out and was hospitalized, but the Big Gun 262 was gone, dropping the total of those airframes to 11. But it's somewhat okay, because in the end they managed to salvage the BK-5 cannon, which is now on display at the Museum of the United States Air Force. They discovered after the flight that the plane wasn't lost to German sabotage, but American negligence. One of the 54th's mechanics admitted to not following the maintenance checklist and skipped over the turbine blades, which is a major issue because early jet engines might as well have been made out of glass sometimes. Extensive pre-flight checks had to be conducted before each flight to make sure the turbine blades wouldn't crack and shatter while spinning at several thousand RPMs mid-flight and causing the kind of explosion that took out the bomber breaker. Pilots also had to fly them carefully because the engines would flame out if the pilots pulled more than 2 Gs in a turn. Honestly, the 262 kind of reminds me of a middle school bully. It seems all big and tough and can hit you pretty hard, but 9 times out of 10 when you hit it back, it just crumbles into dust. And that was just loss number 1. 2 FW-190s were lost when pilots got stuck landing them with reduced visibility, one because of a hydraulic fluid leak and the other because they got blinded by the light, aka the sun was in their eyes, leaving them with a total of 9. While it wasn't lost, another 262 got stuck in cloud cover and overshot the transfer airfield in Cherbourg, France, resulting in him dropping out of the clouds well out over the English Channel and choosing to land on the closest runway he could find. He accidentally became the first pilot to land a jet aircraft on the Channel Island of Jersey, which was so undeveloped it took him 3 days just to get a hold of a phone.
Where am I?
Now for the hard part, figuring out how to get the planes back to the States in one piece. The only way Watson was going to get them back across the ocean intact was to transport them on something like an aircraft carrier. However, America was a bit preoccupied doing important things like turning the Emote and its friends into coral reefs and converting the surrounding islands into replicas of the moon's surface. They didn't have any carriers to spare. The only people who could lend the Wizards a carrier were the same people that Watson had stolen 2 jet bombers from in the last few months. And much to his surprise, the British helped them anyways. In Operation Seahorse, the Brits would lend Watson's Wizards the carrier HMS Reaper, which was ironically a United States Bogue-class escort carrier called the USS Winja that had been lend-leased to the British and renamed. The aircraft were plastic-wrapped to guard against sea spray and shipped back across the ocean, but not before Watson could give an Me-262 to both the French and the British as thanks for their assistance throughout the operation, leaving 9 jets behind for the carrier ride home. The French must have been overjoyed. I mean, they got a free jet and all they had to do was let the Americans drink their way through a few of their towns, which is probably a price in and of itself. But the Brits had to have felt a little smarted. I mean, he stole 2 of the hard-to-find jet bombers, then they lent him an aircraft carrier and only got 1 of the nearly 1,400 German jet fighters produced in return. There had to be at least some people who were looking at this going,
Oh, come on, man.
But upon returning to the United States, the journey wasn't quite finished. The captured planes that weren't crated still had to be flown to Wright Field, Ohio, or to Freeman Field in Indiana. And unfortunately, a few more airframes were lost in this process. An ME-262 suffered a complete brake failure at a refueling stop in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and gave the end of the runway a small dose of topographical reconditioning. The jet was lost, but the pilot was fine. Then they lost another FW-190 during landing because of runaway elevator trim. Quick definition of trim controls. Back before they had fly-by-wire systems, planes wouldn't automatically adjust to changes in flight performance, which would happen naturally as you picked up speed, expended fuel, or dropped ordnance, because it would shift the center of gravity. These wouldn't destabilize the plane due to the loading cloud built into every design, but it would change how the plane flew just enough that the pilot would either have to keep micromanaging the flight controls the whole time or have a system take care of that for him. That system is called trimming, and it's accomplished by using either 1, a bunch of tabs stuck to the end of a flight surface whose positions can be changed without adjusting the whole control, or 2, changing the default position of the control surfaces themselves. The 190 used option 2 and was one of the first German planes to use an electric trim system, but this meant that if you had a runaway trim, which was a common problem for it, you would basically lose control of your entire elevator. Thankfully, that was the last plane lost to a flight accident during the operation, but 1 more airframe had to be written off due to damage. I have no idea of what variety, but a bunch of bureaucratic garbage held up the arrival of the expert on the DO 335 files, and by the time he got there, the mechanics sorting through it had managed to break one. It was such a complicated machine that after a nearly disastrous test flight, they elected to study it on the ground, and probably adding to that decision was its having the distinct prestige of being one of the only planes that Chuck Yeager himself wouldn't have anything to do with. But everything else made it back. The US Navy was given a share of the loot for all the nothing they did in the form of 1 DO 335, 2 AR-234s, and 5 ME-262s. The US Army Air Forces got the rest, and they began cranking away at all the tech because, remember, this whole operation started because they wanted to figure out and deal with whatever new tricks the Japanese had developed from doing their homework with Germany. And then the Japanese surrendered. The war was over, and America was no longer in the mood to maintain a massive military and a giant arsenal of experimental weapons. So they elected to do what the government does best: scrap it in the most heartless way possible. Alongside downsizing the military, they ended up scrapping the majority of the captured aircraft or crushing them into landfill to make a new runway at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. Most of the tech and documentation to develop better guided weapons was also thrown out, along with similar American programs tried out during the early 1940s, because they thought nuclear weapons were going to be the future of everything. It was a classic case of the military sees a shiny and goes for it.
Every word you just spoke has made me violently angry.
General Arnold did, however, manage to get an order through that at least 1 of each airframe be preserved. And from what I can tell, this order was mostly followed, because while some planes like the Alles Kaput were eventually scrapped, I have personally had the privilege of seeing the fuselage of one of the HE-219 night fighters sitting on an exhibit floor at the Udvar-Hazy Center in Northern Virginia.
Yes! That's awesome!
And some of the tech was put into use fairly quickly. While many initial jet fighters like the F-84 Thunderjet and F-9F Panther stuck to straight-wing designs, engineers at North American Aviation would quickly realize the benefits of ME-262 tech and got to work using it in the US's first swept-wing fighter, the F-86 Sabre. The swept wing and the leading-edge slats that provided better lift at low speed and improved turn rate were critical improvements in its early days of operation during the Korean War. The Sabres had such a noticeable impact that the F-84 and F-9F would later be modified with swept wings to create the F-84F Thunderstreak and the F-9F Cougars. The swept wings would also be added to Boeing's legacy-setting jet bomber, the B-47 Stratojet, and the rocket technology recovered along with the scientists integrated through Operation Paperclip like Werner von Braun would eventually be added to the budding rocket industry in the United States to create the spaceflight programs along with Project Redstone, the first medium-range ballistic missile ever ever deployed by the US Army. And what's probably just a perfect cherry on top and the last first to be made from Operation Lusty is a much more wholesome achievement and a nice contrast to the rest of the wartime contributions. Colonel Watson would later give the commander of Freeman Field a token of his gratitude for his help in handling so many of the Five Finger Discount Toys R Us's inventory by giving his wife a ride in the back of the Nachtjäger Me-262, which is absolutely one of the coolest airplanes I can think of to bear the achievement of carrying the first female jet passenger in history. So in summation, if America wants your stuff, we will have it. We'll take it from friends, we'll take it from enemies, hell, we'll take it from ourselves apparently, because stupid government choices. And if you ever land at O'Hare from now on, remember the shoulders one of those runways stands on. Either way, I'm done with my history lessons for a bit, so I'm gonna go back to talking about planes now. So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, please consider checking out my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.